Welcome to the fourth of our public art talks here at the Leslie MFA in Visual Arts January 2023 residency. I'm the director of the program, Ben Sloat. We start our program with a land acknowledgement. Wesleyan University here in Cambridge resides on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Massachusetts people, whose name was appropriated by this Commonwealth. We pay respect to the Massachusetts peoples and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples who have stewarded this land for generations, and we offer our appreciation to the lands and waters for sustaining us. Our general thematic for this residency is nature as knowledge, which responds to the natural world, not as a passive subject matter, but as an active location for various forms of aesthetics, concerns, context, and knowledge. As artists, nature becomes a generative location to consider personal language and metaphor, as well as various forms of knowledge, such as the empirical, indigenous, and declarative. Our program began Monday with a talk by photographer Emmett Gowan, continued Tuesday with a talk by mixed media photographer El Perez, yesterday with a talk by artistic director and chief curator of Storm King Art Center, Nora Lawrence, and we'll conclude tomorrow with visiting faculty Andrew S. Yang. Hope the folks watching the YouTube live stream on the front page of our website can join us for that program. Today's speaker, Tammy Nguyen, is a multimedia artist whose work spans painting, drawing, printmaking, and bookmaking, intersecting geopolitical realities with fiction. Her practice addresses lesser-known histories through a blend of myth and a visual narrative. Exhibitions of hers include those at MoMA PS1, Mellon, Rubin Museum, Factory Contemporary Art Center in Vietnam, Berlin Biennial, and the Bronx Museum. And great to hear you'll be having upcoming shows at Lehman Maupin in ICA Boston here in this area. And Tammy's on the faculty of Wesleyan University. And please join me in welcoming Tammy Nguyen.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I'm here in my studio in Easton, Connecticut. I don't know if it's raining over there, but it just started raining really heavily over here. I'm delighted to share some of my work with you tonight. I'm planning on sharing two major projects with you that I recently completed. For those of you who are unfamiliar with my work, I work in a variety of different mediums. I make a lot of paintings, I write, I create a lot of artist books, and a lot of printmaking is involved in the work as well, works on paper. And I also have an independent publishing platform called Passenger Pigeon Press, where we make a quarterly zine that you can check out on the internet. It's called Martha's Quarterly. What I thought I'd share with you first is this recent book that I wrote, published by Ugly Duckling Press. It was just recently published in 2022. And it's really a book which, you know, much like my other projects, aims to connect a lot of disparate themes into one cohesive body. So something that I have been using as a word that's important in my practice for the last few years is this word confusion. And I like to think about the word confusion because I think that there's so much tension in mixing images together that create sort of like an ethical dilemma, or there's a questioning of what's real and what's not real. So this book weaves together many themes, and one of the themes is this. So I was born without two of my front teeth. These aren't my x-rays. These are just like something I found off of Google to demonstrate the condition. I was born without my lateral incisors, and I found out when I was like 8 years old, and it was a very confusing situation. So I opened this piece of writing by talking about this situation. I later then sort of describe different moments of my upbringing and my childhood. And one of the central characters in this book is my uncle. That is a family portrait of my mom's side of the family in Saigon, Vietnam. And zoomed in on the right-hand side is a picture of my uncle, who becomes kind of this protagonist and symbolic figure in this story. And one of the reasons why I chose to write about him in the context of exploring my missing teeth was because my uncle had really sort of distinct and clear ideas on what was true, what was valuable, and what was beautiful. And one of the things that I remember growing up, he used to come over and watch these like music videos with my parents, these Vietnamese music videos with us. And he would sit there and he would point at which singers had real teeth or fake teeth. And there I am, 8 years old, born without two teeth, knowing that later on I was going to have to contend with having false front teeth. As I discuss my uncle and his journey to America and what he ended up doing, I then weave in the geographical background of this place. This is Phom Nha, Vietnam. It's an ancient cave system that expands northern Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. One of the reasons why I was really intrigued in sort of folding in the sort of environment of Phom Nha in talking about my teeth is because something that is really exciting to me in a lot of my work is connecting the very, very small to the very, very big, the very, very personal to the very, very general. I had an opportunity to go splunking in the cave. So a lot of times with my bodies of work, I will travel to a certain place and do research there on site by, either going into the caves through different travel opportunities or writing about them or drawing and making watercolors on site. This was a picture that I took when we were inside one of the dark caves. It was a really surreal experience because it's very, very physical. There was this one part of the cave where our guide told us to turn off all of the lights and to only use the sounds that we could hear that was like ricocheting off of the rocks to be able to traverse this passageway. This passageway happened to be this little kind of, I don't know, like this deepish stream of water, and my legs had to kind of maneuver over these large boulders, rocks, and things like that to sort of find the different directions to go in. And that was a very sort of otherworldly experience, despite it being very much inside of Earth. So the Phom Nha Karst is historically very significant in Vietnam. It was the site for part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the Ho Chi Minh Trail, many people would credit it as the reason why the Northern Communist Army was able to win the Vietnam War. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was basically a network of communication and transportation. There were porters and other volunteers who would just be stationed at different points in the mountains and in the caves with just bags and other barrels and things like that of goods. And the goods could range from food to weaponry to maybe letters and other types of supplies. And they would just sort of pass along the goods to the next person until whatever was needed in the South would get there. And part of the reason why this network was established was because the United States had already occupied the coast of Vietnam. So there needed to be another way for the Communist Army to be able to communicate with their Southern loyals. So what is a stark contrast to this historical narrative is that today, Phom Nha is, an extraordinary tourist location, and it's also been the site of major Hollywood films like King Kong. And so in learning about this, and actually when I was doing my research on this, the director of King Kong he just kept remarking on how unbelievable this place was. And it is true that when you visit a place, an environment such as this, there is something extraordinarily sublime about it because it's so rare to see a landscape that is at once so beautiful and so treacherous at the same time. But knowing this thing about King Kong became really interesting to me to explore, because it folds in this layer of artifice, this layer of fantasy into a place that is extremely ancient, dense with knowledge, and very, very real for a certain population of people. So as I write about this in the book and I introduce you to King Kong, I then take you all the way over to Malaysia, to a place called Forest City. And Forest City is basically like the opposite of Phomia. Forest City is totally 100% man-made island that exists in between Malaysia and Singapore. And it's a real estate development that is in part investment by the Sultan of Johor, and then also part investment by this major development company in China called Country Garden. And what I did before writing this book was I called the sales office and asked them if I could visit Forest City with the sort of interest in purchasing an investment property. And when I arrived, they greeted me with just so much hospitality. There were buffets everywhere, and these buffets were just filled with, think about like, a very extravagant Las Vegas buffet with like a mountain of cocktail shrimp and curries and blueberry cheesecake and chicken wings and things like that. There was just this elaborate spread. And what was so funny about this place was that they kept advocating how this is utopia. There's, the salesperson kept saying, there's no climate change here. We've got hundreds of species of plants. And when you go outside, all of the landscaping was extremely manicured, but inside of the bathrooms, there were plastic plants that probably covered every inch of the walls. There was a little plastic vine that coiled around the electric plug that plugged in the blow dryer. There was this kind of enthusiasm for nature, and yet there was clearly this artificiality in rendering nature. So this is like another rendering of Forest City. There's also like no pollution in Forest City. All of the cars have to go below ground, and there's swimming pools everywhere. So it's a super safe place for young families with young kids and stuff like that. There was many like kids running around from swimming pool to swimming pool, and there really wasn't any danger of being hit by a car because all of the cars stay underground where all of the pollution is. So as I write about these places, I'm using a lot of juxtaposition to sort of create a tension between what is real and what is not real. I'm going to talk more about my painting process later on, but I thought I would talk about these two particular paintings right now as I'm discussing the book, because I think that the way in which I think about language, whether it's in writing or in painting, has sort of like, there's a pursuit of keeping things concrete while using the concrete language, whether it's shapes or words, to be suggestive of other things. So these are two paintings that I created for Greater New York in 2021. And these are paintings that were being made at the same time that I was writing this book. The painting to the left is called In the Heart of Rimland. And this is very much a painting that is about Forest City to me. Both of the paintings utilize the image of Madonna and Child. I think, I'll talk more about Christianity and Catholicism later on, but this is starting to become a theme that I'm using a lot in my work. I'm thinking a lot about how faith and capitalism can kind of collapse oftentimes elegantly and seamlessly into one another. So here you see the Madonna and Child. The Madonna is wrapped in this beach towel that says Pacific on it. There is this kind of lively, wild banana blossom, and then this eagle. In the background, the eagle is kind of a nod to liberty and freedom and those ideals. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is how this painting is constructed and how this is related to the way in which this book is also constructed. So one thing that I really enjoy doing in my work is I enjoy putting opaque shapes next to transparent shapes with an outline or without an outline. So for example, the way that these leaves and the little mice are rendered is just using this kind of ochre color. But what creates space for me is that there are these like brown fronds, palm trees that are next to it. But really it's just the juxtaposition of brown lines and those yellow shapes that's suggesting that there's a spatial relationship between those objects. In another area, if you look at the towel is made by shapes that are just blocked off on the bottom layer. And then there are these tiny little marks that have a certain sort of staccato to them. On the blue area of the towel, there are lighter blue marks that are put on top. And then on the black purpley area, it's a black color that's on the bottom. And then there's sort of like this purplish color that's sort of just cross-hatched on top. And that's how the illusion of texture is created, but nonetheless, you can identify that it is a mark and a shape that's being combined together. So here, the bananas, right? The bananas are these washes of murky yellow watercolor, and then there's a way to define their dimensionality through mark making. The brown marks that are outlining the bananas define a sense of their dimensionality. And then in a way, these light yellow, white marks suggest a sense of volume, light, or something like that. This is Citizen's Cauldron. So this painting is very much thinking about being inside of the Famia caves. Again, this is another Madonna and Child, but here I'm very much thinking about the viewer being placed inside of the cave and looking out into sort of like the opening where the sun would be. So here, the lily pads are created through these really simple ovals with, little green lines in the middle. The seagrass and things like that, those are made through different kinds of elongated marks that are done pretty swiftly in an even tempo all throughout. And this is how the drapery is made. So the drapery is made with sort of a wash of brownish color on the bottom. And then what you're actually looking at, the marks that create the drapery of the Madonna's, robe or garment is actually done through gilding. There's gilding throughout all of my paintings. Gilding is something that I am extremely invested in. I was able to study illuminated manuscripts with Karen Gorst, who is a living illuminator, which is quite an amazing title. And something that I found so profound about the process of gilding is that gilding can be so ever flat, and yet through the way that it reflects light, it can create a real sense of dimensionality on a very, very flat surface. And then I also like thinking about sort of like the tradition of illuminated manuscripts and how, things that are sacred are illuminated with these precious metals, which emphasize their sort of spiritual significance, but then they simultaneously add in this kind of capital value, which, and I'm very excited about, again, the collision between faith and capitalism. So this is the front and the back of the book. So kind of thinking about this book design in a painterly way, or in the way that I'm thinking about shapes and mark making. This book is created so that the title O is a circle. The back of it is the sort of like the inside of the circle. But O, while it is the letter O and the title of this book, it's also a shape, right? It's the shape of the opening of the cave. It's the shape of the opening of a mouth. So thinking about teeth again as well. O is also a sound. You don't necessarily know that it's called O. It could also be ah, it could also be oo. And so those types of slippages are ideas in language that transform into visual language that are very exciting to me. Throughout the text, there is a string of O's that is often repeated. In this case, this is the first page of the book. So you'll see that this string of O's, which I imagine to be ah, because I'm on the seat of my dentist's chair. This particular string is being vocalized by me. But at other points in the book, this same string of 8 letters is also orated by different characters. It's sung by a porter. It is shouted by this Tarzan character that comes out. It takes on many different personalities and imagined vocal experiences. But one thing that is significant about this is that the way that the O is drawn is actually mimicking a Vietnamese tradition of handwritten script. So one of the reasons why I wanted to sort of tie these together was because I wanted the O sound or the ah sound to have a certain human quality to it, that it was like this, it's this type of human script, this human touch. The other thing I wanted to share with you is sometimes you'll see in the text that there are these accents, such as in that word Mrs. Nguyen cry from the other room. All of the diacritics are handwritten. This particular font is called Vendome font, and it is a French font that was pretty popular during I think the 70s in Vietnam. And when publishing became popular in Vietnam, it was really difficult to find a printing house that would produce all of the diacritics in the Vietnamese language. And so what would happen after a book was printed was it would be printed and then the diacritics would be handwritten in. And so in this book, what the UDP team did was they did all of the diacritics in handwriting to give it this kind of historical texture. So the book measures approximately 4 by 8 inches. And the idea with that was that so that when you open the book, it becomes 8 by 8 inches. And as it suggests this kind of square perfection as you open it up, the idea for me was that there would always be this like invisible circle implied as you turn the pages and read the content. And then as you continue to read the content, the book was split into 8 circles. These 8 circles were all created through the process of creating a suminagashi marbled paper. So suminagashi is a process of Japanese paper marbling where you basically drop sumi ink into a pool of water, and that sumi ink at the beginning drops into these almost perfect circles of ink. After the circles of ink are floating in the water and you've created enough circles of ink so that there are these rings of ink spreading out on your little pool of water, you start to blow on it. And by blowing on it, you're able to create all of these gorgeous patterns and zigzags that look a lot like geological formations. I thought a lot about this process, and I thought about how perfect it was for this particular project. Phong Nha actually means wind blowing through nature's teeth. And so I thought that was a very serendipitous way to tie everything in. So as you read the book, the 8 spreads appear like this. So this is like the cave closed. And then it slowly starts to open up. Opening even more. And then the marbled paper, the Suminagashi paper, there are these collage elements that start to emerge. So here you can see 2 businessmen kind of like pointing at each other, communicating with each other. These businessmen are characters that I'm imagining are pulled from Forest City. Forest City's sort of objects and protagonists and everything are being brought into this Phong Nha world. This is a plate of shrimp and lobster, so this is a nod to the lavish buffets on Forest City. There's a golf player. Forest City had a really, really big golf facility. So if you look closely here, there's all this mid-century modern furniture that's like planted inside of these bursts of ink. And that's also thinking about modernity, thinking about artifice, thinking about how man-made objects can collapse into nature. And then the final spread of the book is you see the same mid-century furniture pieces embedded into the Suminagashi paper, suggesting that now these objects are embedded into the geology of Earth. So as you read the book, at the conclusion of each of the vignettes are these musical phrases. You can think of O as also like a whole note in the musical scale. These musical phrases, though, are actually phrases of the Southern Vietnamese anthem. One thing that's really special about the Southern Vietnamese anthem to me is that my dentist's father was one of the lyricists for this anthem. And it's an anthem that's sung no more except for in different sort of Vietnamese diasporic communities, not in Vietnam. And so there's something suggestive about concluding narratives about, a winning side with sounds that you cannot hear from the losing side. So in the last chapter of the book, the O takes another formation, which is that O's are punched into the margins of the book. The margins of the book is also dissected into 8 increments, suggesting the musical scale. But what I thought could be provocative about this was that as you read this last chapter of the book, the O's could be small and big at the same time. So at once, as you look through the O's, it could be suggestive of the cave opening and you see like a rock, but then as you open the rock, it's actually just a small butterfly. So there's this constant shifting between big and small and big and small. So, I'm writing about this cave. It's hard to not think about Plato's allegory. And also I'm thinking a lot about truth, right? I'm thinking about what defines truth, what creates truth for a certain person, a certain community, what is beautiful, what is truly beautiful. Those are all questions and rhetorical questions that I have no answers to at all. But I'm thinking a lot about Plato's allegory and how light is used as this source of goodness and truth. So right before Plato's allegory in the Republic, there's this scene when Socrates is in a conversation with Glaucon, and he's describing this idea of a divided line, which essentially are these different sections of truth, where the bottommost area of the line is the world of the imagination, and then as you move up that line, you reach these higher and higher and more sort of sophisticated ideas of truth and goodness. And I'm thinking a lot about this line as the steep of the cave, from the bottom of the cave or the inside of the cave getting out of the cave, right? So I'm thinking about the prisoner's journey from the bottom of the cave where it's dark all the way up outward in the cave, outwards of the cave, outside where the sun is shining and illuminating what is truthfully true. So in thinking about that, I'm also thinking about how these O's at the end of the book could be suggestive of that divided line as well. And so as you are reading this last chapter, I'm basically retelling this story about Glaucon and Socrates, but then I'm folding in everything that you had read about Forest City, Famnia, and my fake teeth. So this is my studio. This is where I am right now. This is my studio from last winter, though. And this is when I was working on the paintings for the 12th Berlin Biennial. So these are two pictures of the install shots at the 12th Berlin Biennial, which just happened this last summer. These paintings are inspired by this island that I visited called Pulau Galang, and it's in Indonesia. It's part of the Riau Island agglomeration. Pulau Galang is very close to where my parents were refugees. My parents were refugees on Kuku Island, which is not accessible anymore. And Pulau Galang has now been made into this kind of tourist destination, pilgrimage destination. It's really, really well maintained. And it was really a striking place to visit. This is a view from Pulau Galang looking off into the water. When I was traveling throughout Pulau Galang, you cannot ignore nature. I mean, there were these monkeys that were like just chasing us everywhere. They would like climb on our vehicle. They would just kind of, you know, lurk around any place that you were going. And what you can't see in this picture is the intense humidity and just the sort of the many hundreds of teeming insects that are all around you. Here's just some pictures of the area. So this is like an image of a tombstone in a graveyard that was there. The island it's small, but the refugee camp was actually a lot bigger than my imagination. It was quite built out. There were schools and hospitals and things like that. Each major religion in Vietnam had a place of worship. So this is an image from the Buddhist area. Here's an image from the Protestant area. And then the most striking area to me, which became the subject of my paintings for the Berlin Biennial, was the Catholic worship area. The Catholic worship area was so big. It was so much bigger than the Buddhist area and the Protestant area. It was an entire forest, and throughout the forest, there were these huge golden statues depicting the Stations of the Cross. So this is one of them. And then there was many others, such as these, where it would show Jesus's procession, but then the statues were planted into these, you know, refugee boats. And then they're there throughout the forest. So what was really exciting for me to think about was this idea of salvation and hope by way of a colonial legacy. Because I think that faith in this situation is very real, and it's very important and useful for folks who need faith in a situation like this, right? And there's also, you know, this other thing, which is that Catholicism was brought to Vietnam through many different colonial campaigns that that were also, you know, responsible for erasing parts of Vietnamese culture. They were responsible for, you know, educational infrastructure that were simultaneously productive and kind of responsible for denying a lot of the Vietnamese traditions that had been practiced there for thousands of years. So there's that constant tension, and this is something that is really confusing to me, and it's something that is also really kind of exemplary of how complicated the human condition is. And so this becomes kind of like the beginning of my query through the making of these paintings. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm just gonna sort of move through the 14 paintings. And then after I do that, I'm gonna tell you about how I made them. So this is the first painting. Jesus is condemned to death. Jesus takes up his cross. Jesus falls for the first time. Jesus meets his mother. Simon helps Jesus carry the cross. Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. Jesus falls for the second time. Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. Jesus falls for the third time. Jesus is stripped of his garments. Jesus is nailed to the cross. Jesus dies on the cross. Jesus is taken down from the cross. And Jesus is laid in his tomb. So these are all 14 of them. So before making this body of work, I did a lot of research just on different renderings of the Stations of the Cross. And there's many, there's so many. There's everything from coloring books, the one in the middle, which I ended up using in one of my compositions. This was from a little catalog from a local YMCA somewhere. The one on the right of Veronica wiping Jesus's face, that's from a really beautiful painting somewhere in the Philippines that I found. I don't even remember how I found it or who made it, but I was really struck by it. So in embarking on this large body of work, each painting is 55 inches, or no, 66 inches by 55 inches. What I did was I made like a sort of thumbnail diagram of it. So what you can see here is, like, you know, I made these little crosses and these little stick figures and stuff like that. But what's important is that I have split these 14 paintings up into 4 groups. So there's group A, group B, group C, and then there's a group D. And so if you look at it, you'll see that the progression of the 14 paintings has A, B, C, and D kind of interwoven throughout each other. So I'm gonna go through the 14 paintings now, but as groups. So you guys just saw them in the chronology of the procession, but now I'm gonna show you the paintings in the order that they were made, more or less. So the first group of paintings are like the standalone paintings. So this is the first painting of Jesus is condemned. Then there's Jesus carrying his cross. And then Jesus meets his mother, which comes a few paintings later on. Those are the paintings. So this is the only group of paintings where the paintings don't formally connect with something else. Like there's no, I mean, there's a lot of repetition in other ways, but it's not like they share, for example, a horizon line like one of the other groups. So all of my paintings are created on panels. Large pieces of colored paper is stretched over the panel using glue, and then they're folded over. So actually, if any of you guys are book binders or anything like that, these are actually just giant book covers. They're just wrapped in paper. And then I always start all of the paintings off with a big wash of watercolor as a way to create a kind of an atmosphere or an environment to then work on. I really like working with a very specific and saturated colored paper, because I want the colors in my paintings to seem like they are truly intrinsically part of the painting body. And I feel like when it's a piece of paper that is that color, the color goes through and through, and there's no point in which it is ever a white surface or a birch panel or something like that. It's always truly this deep color. So this is how the paintings are often made. Washes and opaque shapes are placed all over the place. So going back to what I was talking about before with language, I'm constantly putting shapes next to elements of clear marks or other transparent shapes and stuff like that to create a sense of space. So these are some close-ups of these 3 paintings. You'll see that there are a lot of tiny gilded helicopters here. There's helicopters all over these 14 paintings. And then the eyes here, this is one of the rare places where I actually embedded some abalone shell. So this is group B. So unlike group A, where they were standalone paintings, these paintings all use similar strategies. This is something that I'm still playing around with now, and I feel like I'm gonna keep exploring this theme, but I'm really, I don't know, I really wanna figure out a way to fill human bodies with times of day and ideas about weather and the environment. So here, the characters of the Stations of the Cross, Jesus, the women, Veronica, Simon, they're all filled with night. They're all filled with nighttime, but then they're placed in these daytime settings where something else is happening at the same time. So Pan American was truly just an airline of American soft power, especially during the Vietnam War. It was the only airline that had frequent service to Vietnam, and then it was also pretty important in the evacuation of Vietnamese people and other Americans and other war people after the fall of Saigon in 1975. On the right-hand side is an image of helicopters in the Vietnam War. And so in the background of these 4 particular paintings, I'm combining these elements of war, placing the Stations of the Cross in the sort of grand narrative of the Vietnam War. So this is how some of these paintings were made. These are some close-ups. You can see that the Pan Am is illuminated. So That's illuminated with this really special silver that has been dipped in pigment. So it looks, the series comes in like every single color of the rainbow, but this one like looks a lot like the sky. And then the dots on their faces, those are all gilded with this white gold that looks very, very, very bright and almost white. So you can see that that's like, you know, in between his thighs, but then I'm playing with ideas of space and scale. So there's like this, you know, planet or this moon that's inside that area. So this next group C, I'm thinking a lot about repetition, and I'm thinking a lot about how the Stations of the Cross have been reenacted over and over and over again throughout history to keep, you know, the faith alive. These are those 3 paintings. And so when you see them in the 14 painting procession, there's this, I wanted it to have this kind of repetitious slap as you saw it. So it's like you're going through the story, Jesus falls once, then twice, then 3 times. And these paintings are extremely similar, but they have some variation in between them. Also, if you look carefully, the Jesus character here is wearing a mask. And so there are these eyes that belong to the mask, and then there's these other eyes that belong to the figure. Some of the inspirational image that I'm thinking of are these images of different Stations of the Cross reenactments around the world. So this is how some of those paintings were made at the beginning. Big washes of color again. These are the 3 of them finished in my studio. And then these are just some close-ups. So there's a lot of playing with scale again. Each Jesus has like a vulture placed inside of it. The vulture is really big. It occupies like the size of the body. So there's another shifting of scale. Is the vulture actually hidden in the foreground? How does that spatial relationship define itself? And then throughout a lot of my work, the rendering of nature has its own agency. So you rarely see nature interacting with the human figures or the human story / narrative. The animals are just kind of doing their own thing, kind of like in this image. So these are some close-ups. And this is the last grouping. So you'll see here, there's like a horizon line, right? There's a horizon line that extends across these 4 paintings that are more or less towards the end of the series. So just a little bit of geography on where this refugee island was. The star there, the red star on the bottom, that's Galang Island. So that's the refugee island. And then Batam is where one would fly to then take a motorbike and then a boat to get to Galang. So from Batam to Galang was maybe like 40 minutes or so. It wasn't really, really long. But Batam, you see, is sitting right there along the Singapore Strait. You can even hear like Singapore pop radio and everything as you're there. And that's actually where my hotel was, because there weren't really any other accommodations anywhere else except in Batam. So one of the stories that my dad has told me about his experience as a refugee was he told me the story about how when he was on the water, many of the refugee boats break down because they're so overcrowded. But one of the most challenging things about this journey is actually that it's so hot on the water. Like the sun is really beaming on you, and dehydration is very common and also very dangerous. And so my dad had told me the story about how he was so dehydrated that he wanted to just die. But luckily, there was a freight ship that it was like, it was like transporting goods from somewhere else in the world. And then it had sprayed his boat with water, totally relieving everyone who was able to be a part of that big spray. And, when I heard the story, it was, it kind of, it meant a lot, but it meant even more after I visited Pulau Galang, because when you look onto the Singapore Strait, this is all you see. There are freight ships everywhere. And just for a little bit more context, so the Singapore Strait, so they're right there where the red star is, that is where the sort of like the region of the refugee island. These yellow stars, so I'm just kind of tracing, sorry, there's also another star where Ho Chi Minh City is. So that is where one would escape, right? And then all of these yellow stars, so this would be the path that a freight ship would take if you were to transport goods such as like oil from the Middle East or something like that. This is the only way that you would access the greater parts of Asia, making the Singapore Strait and also the Strait of Malacca, which is the larger opening right there, one of the most important conduits of trade in the world. And so in a lot of my work, I told you before, I'm really excited to think about the collision of faith and capitalism. I'm also really excited in thinking about capitalism and just humanity collapse together. So, what is this humanity between the freight ship and this little refugee boat? So in thinking about that, this final grouping thinks a lot about this seascape where there is this human crisis for freedom, and then there's this other economic freedom that is just humming along. It never stops. It's always going and going and going. So this is my studio while I was making these paintings. And then some close-ups. And then here you can start to see those freight ships come in. So freight ships are often also named these really aspirational things like hope, liberty, glory, treasure, triumph. And I love playing with those names in my work. So here are some of those boats. You can see there's an SOS flag there. And then there's also the Stations of the Cross silhouetted in this kind of marbly green silver leaf. There's more of the boats and more of nature, just swinging back and forth. And that's it. Stop sharing so I can see all of your little screens.
Can everyone unmute and give Tammy a round of applause? Thank you. That was amazing.
Really good. We did it in English.
Since we have such a large population on Zoom, I suppose if you have a question, you can use your raise hand feature and I can just okay, people are making noise. So I'm going to start.
Oh, good.
All right, I'm going to start with a question. Hold on, let me mute some folks who are. Okay, good, thank you. So Tammy, I'm just so amazed by the layers in your work and the layers of process and how you've thought out so many details in the materials. So I have tons of questions about that, but I guess I'm really interested in this kind of visual metaphoric language you use, where you're addressing this really wide set of concerns, but it's very kind of implicit and not explicit. And I'm wondering how you came to develop that language and all the kind of hidden elements that are like so rich and maybe not directly visible, but are sort of present in the work as well.
Mm-hmm. well, I don't exactly know how it all ended up here. I mean, but I think that one, you know, when I was, I don't know, like when I was a young student at Cooper Union, this always like resonated with me. I had an amazing drawing professor who talked a lot about nature and about how one, you know, she was really, she came from like a lot of East Asian painting background, and she talked a lot about mark making, and she talked a lot about how one would create a sense of nature, not create nature, but a sense of nature. And so she would talk about how when you would look out into a landscape, there is this natural harmony between very, very small things, medium-sized things, and then very, very large things. And that has always resonated to me in this kind of pursuit of a symphonic narrative and a symphonic sense of space, you know. So I think that in this kind of pursuit, because I'm seduced by this idea of symphony, I started to add things, you know, and then as the things, whether it be content that is personal and philosophical and general and very specific, those would also be paired with a formal expression. So that would be, you know, a very tiny element, a very big element. It might be the material element. It might be the, you know, the, I don't know, the collage element or whatever. And so I think that over time, because I wanted to have this type of graphic impact, I think I've ended up there.
And just to follow up, so do you work in a series because it's so labor intensive that you can kind of, you know, put the gilding on multiple panels at once, or it also, is this typically how you work in a full series at once?
Yeah, you know, because everything is also water based, you know, there's always things kind of, it's like fast and slow, right? With water media, it's like you do it and then there's this waiting period for everything to dry. It's not as long as say oil painting or something like that, but it's a lot of it is like cooking, right? You're kind of just working on many things at the same time. I do think of creating a body of work as if it were a harvest though, you know, like as if I'm kind of like planting the seeds, I'm starting to water it over and over again, and then there comes a day when you just pull everything up and that's your crop. I don't know if it was purposeful, you know, like I think that, you know, as an artist, you know, at the beginning you're just like schlepping it, and so you're trying to make work anytime that you can in between your jobs and stuff, and then eventually it kind of, this is the way it happened, you know. So yeah, I do work on many things at once, and I enjoy it and it feels natural. But if you asked me 10 years ago if this was what I set out to do, I'm not so sure if I would say yes.
Interesting. Do folks have questions? Please use your raise hand feature or put it in the chat and I'll be able to pass it along. And while we're waiting for those to populate, could you, I know this is maybe not something you want to talk about, but like, can you share some strategies towards your next show? Is it going to be a series that you're working on simultaneously, or how do you solve these concerns?
Well, right. Okay. So there's a lot of things happening simultaneously, right? If I'm going to lift my laptop up and you'll only see the paintings, because there's also artist books that are being made, but they're like under weights right now and the paper is in a flat file. But I'll show everyone. This is my studio. So those are all the paintings in the background. Here, let me pull this out. Do you guys see that? There's like paintings on all of those like horses and everything. So that's how it's made, you know, like I just kind of work on it. And then the ones in the background, those are all done. So that's kind of how it's made. And then my setup is pretty simple. I mix colors in these little cups of paint and I just walk around and I just use that color all over the place until it's time to use the next color.
Oh, fantastic. So we have a question from Naima, then Craig Stockwell, and then Peter. So Naima, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
The work is so so beautiful.
Thank you.
First of all, it's really amazing. My question was, you have so many layers of information, but yet the pieces still feel very like, there's like a lot of emotion in them and they're still very visceral. And so I'm wondering how you're able to sort of marry the two, because I find sometimes I have, the trouble with wanting to communicate the information, but also put the emotion behind it.
Yeah, that's like that definitely didn't come easy. Like I feel like there was a time, I mean, I think I still do this actually, like, but I do it less now. But it's the risk of being a maximalist, right? Is that you can easily kind of overcook a lot of the work, right? Like everything is so caked together because the content is so important or whatever. That the clarity or the sort of the kind of the visceral impact is lost. And I think that for me, something that I always turn back to is the form. So what if, for, I'm thinking a lot about like these images from the Cold War right now, and I'm making an image of President Eisenhower giving a speech, and it's so important that it was him, it's so important that it was like this particular cropping or whatever, but when it comes to making the painting, he's like, he's covered in leaves or whatever, the leaf, the way that his glasses look, the little insects that are crawling around his head or in the background, or whatever, those moments of mark making and drawing need to be unintellectual to me. Like they need to have this kind of rhythm, this kind of breath of life that is not stopped by conceptual framework. So I feel like for me, it's deciding on the right color, the right viscosity of paint in my example. Like I feel like the viscosity of the paint helps me move. The opacity of the paint is really important. So if I get that right, and the drawing is right, then I think that the content kind of follows that. So that's what's happened in my work. I know it's probably very different for other artists, but that's one way I've been able to kind of conduct the different layers of narratives in my work.
Great. Craig? Craig, you're muted.
Sorry, it wasn't unmuting. Hi, thank you so much.
Hi.
And I really appreciate your deep attention to process and to, sort of nerdy little things about painting. And that's terrific. And I'm curious, your project is really large, it seems to me. Your project of investigating history, personal history, global history, cultural history. And I think that for the most part, we are called upon as painters these days to sort of make a case for, what can painting do? So I'm just curious, a really simple question, but a deep question, why painting? How do you find painting useful in your project, in the large project?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, I kind of want to give this question two answers. The first is I have a very visceral relationship with painting. Like I feel like when I go and look at paintings, whether or not I end up learning something about history or learning something about myself, the pathway to that, that moment of arrival is almost always visceral. I'm also someone who has a very visceral engagement with nature. Like I'm someone who still finds like the peak of a mountain quite sublime, and I find that the ocean is still sublime to me, even though I've seen it so many times throughout my life. And there's something about that profundity that I also feel in painting. So this is just me as a person with feelings, and that's how I feel about painting. And when I paint and when I'm able to create a painting that can exert a kind of visceral relationship with someone, I feel like it's very special. You know, I don't think that it's much more than that, but it's really lovely to have that kind of connection with someone, even if I never find out about it. That's kind of like an isolated human experience that I find really special that I get to be a part of, you know? Now, using that to explore elements of history, I find, and elements of personal narrative, elements of identity, whatever, I find to be a provocative opportunity. You know, like, why not engage with something that moves me so deeply with content that is so important to my intellectual queries, right? I don't, you know, there's a big why not there. Now, I think though that, you know, to sort of play devil's advocate to my own answer, sometimes painting can be limiting because of this seduction, because of this kind of self-contemplation quality that it has. And so I think that that is why I also write. And that's also why I create books and create other types of works that don't pull on the same heartstrings as paintings do, you know? So there is two sides to that. And so when I feel I want to really take on a historical subject that I want to communicate in a more literal way, well, then there's also writing. There's also the making of artist books that kind of live in between the spaces of written language and painterly language, right? So there's all these other things that are happening in the practice as well that offer me this kind of communicative satisfaction.
Thank you. Wonderful answer.
Question from Peter.
Hi, Tammy. Thank you so much. That was
Hi.
a great presentation. I think you just basically answered a substantial part of my question, which was, you know, what is it that, you know, book arts offer you that painting doesn't, and vice versa. And, you know, I have this conversation with students all the time in terms of considering these, you know, crudely speaking, as sort of content delivery systems and their various virtues. So, and I thought your answer is really wonderful in terms of the kind of reflexive dimension of painting and the kind of more granular aspects of the book, that type of format. But I'm also, the second part of the question is something I'm personally interested in, is where is the overlap between them for you? You know, what's their point of convergence? Is there something they share in common?
I think that they all are different ways of compressing layers, but I think they obviously do them in different ways, because in a painting you have, it's all happening simultaneously, right? And like one of the coolest opportunities of artist bookmaking is the fact that you can see that simultaneity split across pages, split across the spine, split across the book structure. And in painting, you don't have that. So how, you know, sort of like the algebra of how the layers come together, I think that is the commonality between artist books and painting, but how they kind of enter the experience of the viewer are extremely different, you know. And I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that, you know, the audiences for these mediums are really different, you know. Like for an artist book, you know, I think the most ideal situation in our contemporary art viewing world is in a special collection, which is like there's a lot of effort that it takes to go to one, to be able to look through it. Painting, though very elitist in some ways, has this kind of community aspect to it where it's like in a room, you can see it. So there's these other ways in which the layers then, you know, put themselves into the world.
Okay, wonderful, thank you.
I see a comment by Stuart in the chat. Stuart, can you share your comment?
Sure. Hi, Tammy. Thanks so much.
Hi.
Wonderful, wonderful talk. I was just commenting that what you were talking about in terms of how your technique, the formal and compositional elements, your handling of the paint drive the narrative or subtend the narrative in fundamental ways, reminds me of a talk that Vincent Desiderio gave years ago in this program, where he was discussing what he calls technical narrativity is. For him, I think technique is the primary site or locus of meaning in painting, and the subject matter content comes secondary. But I did have a question. I was wondering, just since we're in a higher ed context, how your work informs your teaching, or what kinds of courses you teach, or how you communicate some of what you've been discussing with us to undergraduate students who may or may not be fine arts majors, for example.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So at Wesleyan, I teach printmaking and book art. So I actually don't teach painting at all. But across those, so the 4 courses that I teach a class called Print Culture, which is maybe a kind of an introduction course that goes through the different mediums of printmaking. And then I teach a course called Codex Unbound, which is all about the artist book. And then after that, in the spring semester, I teach these 2 courses. One's called Fast and Furious, which is all about zines and posters and t-shirts and tote bags. And then another one is called Surface Tension, where we make illuminated manuscripts and we work with collagraphs and collage and slower methods of making works on paper. And the reason why I kind of describe all of that is because in the sort of creation and curation of these 4 courses, one thing I was thinking a lot about is how complex narratives find their output in these different attitudes about printmaking. So in a course like Fast and Furious, where you're making a zine, you know, a certain kind of narrative finds a lot of power in, for example, reproduction, right? Another kind of complicated narrative may find another really unique power in being a precious illuminated manuscript. So those are some of the ways in which narrative thinking in visual art enters my pedagogy.
I had a question, Tammy, about, there's something to be said about the kind of radical gesture of having the subject of the Stations of the Cross in a kind of contemporary art setting like the Berlin Biennial. So I was curious about that and that tether to a kind of Western art history and how that's been seen, though, of course, it's been also imaged in other cultures around the world. But I'm also curious about audience and how your work has been received in a kind of European context versus an Asian context, an American context. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know this. I don't want this to be a cop-out answer, but Cotter Atia, who was curating the Berlin Biennial, was looking for some stuff about religion and environment. So he kind of just that just happened, and that was great for me. So I don't know if I was being radical, because I was already thinking about it, and it was just I mean, these are intrigues of mine that have been there long before the invitation, and I think that coincidence was very fruitful. But to your other question about audience, though, I wish I knew more about how the audience have received it. Like, I think that from what I hear from like the Vietnamese community in Vietnam is there's something interesting about how I'm approaching Vietnamese history, maybe because there's an environmental kind of perspective to it. It's not, it's not a documentative project in the way that I'm like mining an archive and then presenting it or something like that. So there is this kind of there's this kind of myth making in it as I metabolize the information and create paintings out of it. So maybe I think that is resonating with certain folks who have reached out to me. I think with the Europeans that I've heard from, a lot of them have been from the Vietnamese diaspora. And so it's been really exciting to engage with them to talk about these different histories that we come from and how we ended up where we are, But I really do wish that I knew more about how audiences are reacting to it. I feel like you end up just kind of hearing things in passing or things in context because maybe it's written about in the context of, other themes in the show. So I don't know. I don't know.
Anyway, that's great. Can we all unmute one more time and give Tammy another round of applause? Thank you so much for your talk today.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it was my pleasure to be here.